Welcome back to the last formal sessions of the afternoon. And the next two sessions are going to be focused on innovation and disruption across the regulatory and HTA landscape. And we have two separate sessions, as I mentioned, in this regard. The first session is really focusing on the HTA landscape and time to commit to a process to reevaluate oncology drugs. And for this session, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Sandeep, who's better known as Sandy, a co-founder of the Physician Alliance for Cancer Care and Treatment organization, who is also an oncologist, which is an oncologist-led advocacy coalition, and is a scientific advisor for the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network and the Canadian Breast Cancer Network as well. Sandy is currently a medical oncologist at the Ottawa Hospital Cancer Center, focusing on the treatment of breast, prostate cancers, and melanoma, and lead for the breast cancer disease site. We also welcome Alexandra Chambers, who is the manager of National Oncology Policy at Novartis Oncology. She has more than 15 years of experience in health technology for both health technology assessment for both pharmaceuticals and medical advices. Prior to joining Novartis, Alex was the director of CADIS, Pan-Canadian Oncology Review, which conducts HTAs for new oncology drugs. Welcome to both of you. We're going to begin with a presentation from Sandy, and then over to, after a brief dialogue, Alex will share a few slides with us as well. So Sandy, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So thank you for inviting me. I hope to just paint a landscape of where things stand today from the clinicians and perhaps the patient perspective on what's actually getting in the way of our treating our patients correctly. So this is kind of my background in terms of advocacy. I never intended to be kind of a screamer with advocacy, but rather believe in collaborative work together, agreeing on problems and bringing down barriers. And that's what I hope to get your help with today. So what problems are we facing? Well, we know all the steps in the process. I think we've learned them over the years. Health Canada approves the drug for safety and effectiveness. Their approval often lags behind FTA and often behind Europe. Well, that may be improving now with this collaborative effort called Project Orbis. Our Health Canada people apparently are saying that Orbis is too fast, there are too many drugs coming at them, and they aren't able to cope, which is another problem. CADIS has 3 A's defining their kind of reason for being. So accessibility, affordability, and appropriateness. And a lot of clinicians now fear that CADIS is not meeting our needs correctly, and we're stuck with how to fix it. Their decisions on getting a review of medications now is taking about 6 to 12 months after Health Canada approval. Their clinical review looks at, does the drug add value in the therapeutic landscape? And the economic review looks at cost benefit. And if a drug is felt to be clinically beneficial, it moves on to PCPA for price negotiations. Those negotiations may not even start for more than 6 months afterwards. And the problem is that our patients are waiting and frankly dying while they're waiting for new breakthrough medications. In terms of the accessibility, we don't really have any evidence that it's being prioritized. We look at other jurisdictions like UK, Germany, Italy, for example. I'll show you a few of them, but they have developed recent processes for rapid initial access. When I used to talk about having kind of a back door for urgent access before, everyone kind of got upset. The back door implied something sneaky or inappropriate. But they have developed these rapid access programs to allow access while the methodical comprehensive reviews are underway. The UK, as I'll show you, moved from 10 out of 12 OECD countries in rapidity of access to cancer drugs to number 3. And priority there is now given to access over the other priorities. Quebec and INES uniquely more factor in societal value and patient input than CADIS does. And we feel that evolution is needed to kind of move in these directions. So if you look on the left from 2010, this was a British report commissioned by Sir Mike Richards, really trying to define how well the UK was doing. And you can see that they're at the bottom. And this caused an emergency fund to be created for NICE and to revamp how they approach things. And on the right, you can see 2 bands of years, very close together, but most recently from 2011 to 2016, to see, compared to the median in the middle row, in the blue row in the center of the graph on the right, where Canada stands at the bottom, much further behind in terms of rapidity and how many new drugs are actually funded for cancer in Canada, only above New Zealand in that analysis. So there's been a lot of publications, including from Dr. Clemens, who you heard about earlier from Ottawa, looking at the importance of greater speed in drug development. My colleague, Dr. Stewart, a lung cancer treater, looked at this very methodically, looking at models in terms of the impact of the delay from drug discovery, drug approval, to final access, and how many lives are lost. And it's kind of wordy. I'll just highlight the point that the life years lost between drug discovery and approval is over 1 million globally, strictly because of delays to access. And you can pare that down to Canadian numbers for the sake of advocacy. Overall, what about timeliness? Our processes are taking 1 or 2 years after U.S. access, even if approved. That is not acceptable. I think we need to have performance standards. The government likes performance standards for us, for clinicians, for how fast we see patients, for example. And I think we have to demand that government also has performance standards, that while we accept and applaud the rigor of their process, they cannot go on forever. If their processes they do serially can be amalgamated, if they can actually crunch them into at least half the time, that will be a start. Canadians would probably accept 6 months, but not 2 years. And when I met before with the deputy minister in Ontario, he was shocked at that and thought I was joking. What would ministers and deputy ministers say? I bet if we surveyed them, they would not think 2 years was appropriate. How do we justify that? So in terms, again, of what's happening in the UK, just to give an example, they have this managed access program now. The graph basically just says they have this earlier open door, where if a drug is coming through that doesn't fit past the bar, like none of them do nowadays, for immediate access based on cost, they go through this managed access review. And then they go through the methodical review. If they're approved for fast tracking, 86% did actually get approved finally at the end of the day, allowing patients immediate access. In France, they have a similar program called the ATU, the Temporary Authorization for Use, that allowed access more than 2 years before final approval, and they allowed non-traditional endpoints like single-arm data when very impressive and real-world evidence. Australia, that was a laggard below Canada and more in line with New Zealand, has also been looking at fast-tracking regimens this year alone. So they have evolved to understand the importance of modern surrogate endpoints. Progression-free survival were really impressive, pathologic complete responses, disease-free survival, and Canada has not. The process has been inconsistent, sometimes hypocritical, and they have rarely been accepting phase 2 data. Their guidelines on what they've been accepting have been different for hematologic malignancies and solid tumors. And I would argue we need to have an evolution in collaboration and alignment with other health technology bodies. To show it a different way on the left, if you look at in the blue columns, the median of OECD countries, how many meds new drugs are actually funded for cancer. In the green bar, it's about 60% in Canada. And on the right, you see the duration, where the OECD was about 270 days to get final approval. It was over 400 days in Canada for oncology drugs. So in terms of value, societal value is not really being duly considered. They often now have gone back to this old benchmark they had somewhat discarded before, of a $50,000 per quality life year gained benchmark to accept a new oncology drug. This actually horrifies clinicians and patients. It was arbitrary, it was never validated or evidence-based, and it was derived from work on the value cost effectiveness of dialysis for elderly and diabetic patients in the 1980s. I was there. I believe Andreas Lapakis, who went to ISIS, was involved in that research. It was not designed for oncology, and it was never really discussed. It was never even inflation adjusted. So how appropriate is that? It's not in line with other countries. And the threshold clearly needs to be different for rare diseases. Rare diseases will be much more costly to go through drug development cycles. The trials are now very costly to run, and this really is not acceptable as a benchmark. What about ethics? Clearly, it's a two-tier system now in Canada. Government does not like to acknowledge that. Federal government employees and ministers have access to the top-tier insurance that regular Canadians do not. For cancer drugs, because often we're dealing with older patients, only roughly a third of people had private insurance, often with suboptimal coverage. What about legalities? CADTH has been defined recently as a quasi-judicial body with no oversight. There are movements afoot to really question the legality of their restrictions currently. What about the expertise issue? They used to have in-person input from at least 3 clinician experts when reviewing drugs. Largely because of COVID, that's been restricted now to written submissions only. We have late notifications, short deadlines for very busy clinicians, and while they can take months or a year to get things done, we have to often submit within 2 weeks and as a group, which is very difficult to coordinate. The written input is static. We don't have a chance to discuss the back and forth and nuances. And there are recent examples of key opinion leaders seemingly deliberately excluded from discussions. And the appeal mechanism, while looking good on paper, is not really meaningful. So we're an outlier. Canada rightly can make their own decisions, I would say, but when most international bodies, and even within Canada, Quebec, follow guidelines and there are disparities in access and approval speeds, the disparities need justification. Canada is still only above New Zealand and Portugal regarding cancer drug access. It is very hard to understand, too, how in Canada, 7 of 36 cancer drugs recently had differing recommendations from INES and CADTH. How different can the realities of cancer care be between Quebec and rest of Canada, much less Canada and other modern OECD countries? So getting back to the 3 A's of CADTH, the accessibility, I don't believe that this cancer drug access is a top priority. It's not demonstrably so. It's not being achieved for many drugs. What about affordability? It's an important part of their analysis, but no cancer drugs that are approved are ever approved on price and clinical. They're always turned down pending negotiations at PCPA. Despite this access and this extra measure of analysis, Canada now spends more than most OECD countries per capita on drugs in general. So even though we have this rigor that's slow and ineffective, we're not getting affordability. And how about appropriateness? Again, I don't think we're really using targets that are felt to be clinically meaningful by experts and patients. What about next steps? I would just look at the broad questions I've outlined. Does anyone feel 1.5 to 2 years delay in access after evidence is okay? Why is there no sense of urgency around cancer? Why are there no processes in place now to at least build up the resources to improve things? Now even Health Canada is saying, well, Orbis is too fast. They're almost implying we should back out of it because the waterfall, the tsunami of drugs is too difficult for them to keep up with. That is the reality. We are grateful that we have a tsunami of new breakthrough drugs coming in with new mechanisms of action and much better efficacy signals than we've seen in decades past. Can we not copy and paste from other successful jurisdictions, looking at what the UK has done? It's kind of insulting, I think, to our HTAC people to imply this, but maybe we should. I mean, we're a relatively small population. What is the cost effectiveness of their process? All the people they employ, the time they spend. I wonder even if you looked at the data, we probably approve the majority of drugs that they approve elsewhere. Would it not be cheaper for us just to automatically rubber stamp other non-US Western jurisdictions and get on with it? So controversial maybe comments, but kind of reflecting, I think, the frustration we're seeing. We are dealing now with a time of tremendous breakthroughs coming at us very quickly, new technologies, not just therapeutics, diagnostics, molecular diagnostics to better select patients and guide therapies, and we just don't seem to be able to keep up. We're not getting an adequate discussion of these problems, largely because our healthcare systems now are catastrophically falling apart across Canada in all respects. So we will be facing challenges, and I look forward to the discussion about how we might engage different stakeholders. So with that positive spin, I'll pass the torch.
Sandy, first and foremost, thank you very much for a succinct, clear conversation on what I call the issues that we need to deal with. So I'm not sure exactly where to start, but I'm going to dive in and I'm going to bring Alexandra into this conversation so we can at least start the conversation. You asked the question yourself is, why are we not talking about this? The facts are clear. The data is there. Why are we not talking about this? I'll leave that open to either of you to take on. Maybe Sandy, you opened the door to the question, so I'm going to maybe get you to start with that. Why is this not important?
There have been so many publications in Canada about these problems for a while, and I don't think that the medical angle, the publications, the academic approach is getting any response. I think governments are getting away with what they can get away with without public anger. In the past, I've had 6 patients of mine in my group in Toronto on their front page of the National Globe advocating for change. And that's not how we should be getting things approved and fast-tracked. It should not be through the media. It should be through proper processes. Our processes are rigorous, and they're frankly well constructed with respected people taking part in them, but they're not meeting our needs. So I think it's inertia, and it's the fact that governments can get away with it because people haven't been complaining. The public has a limited appetite for stress and for dealing with crises, and now we're dealing with so many crises globally. I think people just can't, get engaged unless it really affects them personally. We do have momentum afoot right now. We have formal and informal coalitions with radiation oncologists, oncology nurses. When I presented at CANO, the nursing oncology meeting in Victoria last weekend, with CAFO, the pharmacist in oncology in Canada, surgical oncologists, to put our voices together. And I think we have to really get collaborative discussions with government at the political level to say you're responsible for these organizations below you. You have to send a message from the top down to fix it. The committees like CADA, all these government bodies, they think they're doing things really well because the rigor is there, because the process is good, because they put the round pegs in the round holes. Maybe they meet their budget endpoints, but it clearly is not meeting the important goals that we face. And I think we have to get pressure from the top down.
Right. A process is really only as good as the outcomes it provides. And if the outcomes are what we're experiencing now, then one has to really question the processes. Alexandra, I'm going to bring you into this conversation now. There's dozens of other countries ahead of Canada who are doing things much better. Sandy, you referenced Project Orbis as being one of those things. You also referenced what's happening in the UK. There is clearly benchmarks for doing better here. Where should we be looking first? Number one, is there one country that is doing this bigger, better than others? And number two, how do we take a step towards that?
It's a great question, and maybe before I jump in, maybe just to respond to a couple of things that Sandy said, because I think there are a lot of opportunities, and again, we've spent a lot of time talking about what is it we can be doing better, what do we need to be doing better, and every month you see in Current Oncology there's another paper about how we can be doing things differently. So I'm totally aligned that there's a lot of discussion, and maybe not maybe, but definitely not as much action as we need to see. If I think back to the time where I was with Cadith and recognizing even at that time how busy everything was and how it's such a cycle and there's so much happening all the time. It's, is there that time and energy for people to take that step back, to look at the bigger picture and to actually make change as opposed to just putting out the fires and keeping up? Because I think we can see as therapies are evolving, things are getting so much more complex. Things are different. You mentioned the diagnostics and how everything fits together. This isn't the system, when Cadith or CODA was created 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the therapies were different then, and it was different. And, I guess, the question is, has Cadith and the other agencies around it evolved to address, what is happening today? And I think it's complex, and I don't know that there's a single answer. But to answer your question about, who's doing it better, I think there's a number of countries that are doing things differently and at least they're trying. And I think that is where Canada needs to start. You look at the UK, they've got their cancer drug fund. They started it 10 years ago. They had to revamp it, 4 or 5 years ago, because they didn't get it right from the outset. And so they are changing it. The Netherlands is the same. The Netherlands doesn't have it perfect, but they're trying different things, and they're making the effort to keep evolving and moving forward, where I think, and Sandy, you said it, there's some inertia, but I think it's not in pointing fingers and blame. It's just, there's a lot going on, and, whose responsibility is it to keep us all moving forward, and who is accountable for making those changes?
When I actually met with the head of PCPA, the previous head of PCPA, at a meeting in Toronto, it must have been 3 years ago or 4 years ago, at the water cooler, she asked me, well, this is a great discussion, but why are oncologists always in such a rush? And I thought, for a lead of that kind of committee to not have the insight to realize how much of a rush there is, and we should be no more of a rush, was kind of shocking. I had a discussion with Jamie Kippen, who's the Chief of Staff for the Federal Minister of Health, a couple of months ago. And he asked the question you asked: who should we be aiming to emulate to do this better? And he was actually very happy that I said the UK. I think he was afraid I would say we want the US model, which is really, probably not the best model, but to have a model of a country with socialized medicine, one of our kind of peers in many ways, they approach healthcare funding, with rigor, with proper HTA analysis. He was quite open to that. We do have, he invited me to arrange a follow-up meeting to discuss this further, and I'm hoping to get a band together of interested stakeholders.
Sandy, you mentioned the fact that, particularly when you lay out the facts, ministers likely would not see the acceptability of some of the circumstances that we're facing now. So is it a matter of communication? Is it a matter of advocacy? It is a matter of putting facts, right table, right people?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that comes from discussions again at the political level moving down. In the past, point to media about Mrs. Smith who can't get the right treatment necessary is not optimal. It's stressful for patients. It's stressful for other patients who read about these things. I think there is a process that should be respected, but for them also to show respect for our patients. I think we talked before with the Cancer Survivor Network about having a patient charter of rights for cancer patients in Canada. Basically saying what they deserve, in terms of speed and process. If we can just do what we do, in half the time, that'd be a great start. And to make sure we allocate the resources, we're going to need more resources. We're going to need more people, more experts to handle this deluge. Just as we have to adapt in clinic. We don't have enough room in clinics. We don't have enough staff. We've always had to adapt. We've torn down walls. We've worked longer hours, even to our detriment, like we had to through COVID. And they don't seem to have any sense of urgency and adaptation, evolution that we have to argue for.
Alex, you referenced the fact there is a lot, that's an understatement to say there is a lot going on in healthcare. But maybe we can break down what I call what specifically inside the process. We've chatted at a very macro level. I wonder if we could bring this down a couple of levels at a micro level on the process itself, and where we could start to tackle some of the concerns. There's much written from Innovative Medicines Canada about the sequential review process as an example. Is that a starting place? Maybe we can chat just a little bit about what are some of the specific things that are broken and how I may tackle it step by step.
So I'll jump in there. And I think a lot of headway has been made with Health Canada and the HTA agencies in terms of managing their timelines. So, if a company is prepared, they can make a submission to Health Canada, and they can go into the HTA agencies in parallel. So in theory, you could get a Health Canada approval and an HTA recommendation within a month. And so that, and I think in terms of timelines, that's very impressive. I think where there's less clarity, less transparency is what happens after that HTA recommendation, where something will go into PCPA for negotiation. And then once the negotiation's finished, each province, will make their own decision on whether a drug will be funded or not. And they each have their own timelines. And I think that part of it is a little more difficult to wrap your head around. Like, how long does that take? What is an optimal timeline? What's a reasonable timeline? And looking at where we are right now, I think there's a lot of opportunity, even just to understand what are some of the barriers in that space. I understand PCPA has a backlog, and I know they're looking for more staff, and they're trying to catch up. But what else? What are the other barriers in that space? And I think it's not entirely clear. And again, I know a lot of people will point to the PCPA and say it's them, but industry comes to the table too. So there's an ownership on the part of industry as well to participate in fair negotiations as well.
Mm-hmm.
There was a time, when I used to say that our processes were so good that we almost always got the drugs we needed, although it just took too long. I'm not sure that's true anymore. These processes are getting in the way of maybe ever getting new breakthrough drugs. And part of the reason is because of the PMPRB reform. We didn't talk about that so much, but the benchmark for cost effectiveness and what they will accept and not accept, 50,000 for a quality adjusted life year, for example. One drug recently, I think through PCPA, the manufacturer was told that at any cost, at any price, it would not be affordable. And even it would be affordable if the company paid the government for every patient that got it, not the other way around. So like a net negative cost would only be then justifiable. The PMPRB reform is perhaps laudable in some ways. We have a lot of drugs that we could save on. So many old drugs that have gone generic, where we could perhaps negotiate better for one generic supplier or two. But rare diseases and cancer have to be an exception, and there's no process for that, for any exception. The ministers have heads of ODB and drug programs have said, well, we can't have cancer exceptionalism. But everything about cancer is exceptional. The threat to life and limb immediately. We have cancer registries that other diseases don't have. We have special tracking of outcomes for cancer. So we have to recognize that it's exceptional and really have special programs to fast track like they have in every other country now. I'm quite afraid that if these PMPRB negotiations, which are now being rebooted after some quiescence, if they're rebooted again, many companies are saying drugs may not come to Canada until like fifth country launch, like we see in Eastern Europe or the Middle East. They're also right now, as you know, they're giving compassionate access to drugs for 6 months to a year to allow time for our processes. If our processes take 2 years, global headquarters are not willing to give Canada a free drug for 2 years. And we may lose access for our patients to any supply, any kind of bridging. Even clinical trials may be compromised. Access to clinical trials. Our number of oncology clinical trials 2 years ago to 1 year ago had dropped significantly, possibly because of the specter of the PMPRB reform and the impact on getting drugs to launch in Canada subsequently. So there are a lot of shadows over things that really threaten to make things even worse.
I'm going to hold for a moment and ask you, Alex, I know that you've got a small presentation with some great insight to share with us as well. Why don't we go to that and bring that information onto the table now too?
Absolutely. Great. So Sandy and I had the opportunity to publish a study earlier this year asking the question whether it was time to commit to a process to reevaluate oncology drugs. So I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of that. Just trying to move my slide forward. There we go. So, and we've talked about this already, so I won't belabor the point, but there's really this balancing act that we face between urgency and caution. So urgency in the fact that we've got all these exciting new therapies with the potential to extend lives, to improve quality of life. But then on the flip side, a lot of times, because we're in this era of precision medicine, you've got a smaller patient population. So the trials that we've been able to conduct in the past with a lot of rigor they can be less rigorous now because you're dealing with a smaller patient population, but you still need to have confidence that that drug is effective and safe compared to what is existing. And we aren't alone here when we're looking at the urgency and caution. You can go to the next slide. Thanks. So a lot of different stakeholders and jurisdictions have looked at this balance. So, looking at Health Canada, they have a pathway for conditional approvals through their NOCC process. The HTA agencies for several years have included reassessment in their strategic plans and really thinking about, how do they reevaluate or reassess? When you think about research, you've got the Can Revalue collaboration where they're looking at how you can conduct real-world evidence to inform reassessments or reevaluations. From a provincial perspective, just one example is Cancer Care Ontario's provincial evidence building program, looking at drugs that have access, but ensuring that they are delivering the value that we think they are. And then Sandy's already talked about the international examples where there are many. So this isn't new, this concept of urgency and caution. So we can go to the next slide. So before I go into the results, and I just have a couple of slides on the study that we did in the results, I wanted to reground ourselves on the definition of HTA. And this was actually revisited a few years ago by a number of different HTA agencies around the world, including CADTH. And if I can point you to the last part, where they're looking at determining the value of a health technology at different points in its life cycle, and that really started the conversation between ourselves about how do we continue this conversation and see if it is time to find a way to do some reevaluations. If we can go to the next slide. So like I said, we published this study earlier this year where what we did was we did an analysis of Health Canada approvals for solid tumor indications from January 2017 until October of last year. And we were really looking at three factors to consider the certainty at the time of the HTA recommendation. So the first was looking at overall survival, whether overall survival was the primary endpoint. Secondly, whether overall survival was measurable at the time of the HTA recommendation. And then third, looking at gaps in the evidence identified by the expert review committee. And just a quick caveat here, Sandy and I spoke quite a bit about the endpoints that we wanted to look at. And we did look at overall survival, but we recognize fully that there are other important endpoints that are critical to clinical decision making for patients and clinicians. But for the purpose of this study, we really just looked at overall survival. If you can jump to the next slide. So as I said, there were the three factors. So when looking at the first two factors, was overall survival the primary endpoint, and was overall survival measurable at the time of the recommendation? So the blue bars represent overall survival as a primary endpoint, and the green whether it was a secondary endpoint. So you can see that overall survival is more often a secondary endpoint than a primary endpoint. And then, when we ask the question, was overall survival measurable at the time of the HTA recommendation? When you look at both the positive and the negative HTA recommendations, more often overall survival was not available at the time of the HTA recommendation. So even if we took a step back and said, where would you start doing a reevaluation? If you even looked at, actually, if you could just click, there's just a little animation here. Even if you looked at these 5 recommendations where there was where overall survival was the primary endpoint, but overall survival wasn't measurable at the time of the HTA recommendation, is it worth even just starting and looking at these ones, or could this be somewhere to start? And then next slide. I think this is the last slide. And so the third factor we were looking at was what were the gaps in evidence that were identified by the expert review committee. And by far, you can see the gap in evidence was in sequencing, and CADTH has implemented their provisional funding algorithms to really look at this question of sequencing. So a number of those are taken care of. However, about a third of the recommendations, there was a gap in evidence and a question of the magnitude of the clinical benefit. So uncertainty in the clinical benefit. So again, the question arises, if there could be an opportunity to reevaluate some of these recommendations, might this be somewhere where you would want to start and confirm that that magnitude of clinical benefit was actually there? And I think one concluding slide. So again, there is a need for a process for reevaluation, and it has been recognized broadly across several stakeholders and jurisdictions, and especially considering there are clear signals that there's often uncertainty at the time of the HTA recommendation. And I'll just end it there.
Thank you, Alex. Is this issue on uncertainty being dealt with by other global countries? Have other countries demonstrated that they can deal with this topic in new and fresh, innovative ways?
I can't speak to that specifically about what other countries have done, but I think their framework for the rapid approval reflects that they're open to these surrogate endpoints that we think would be predictive of that in the future. I think Alexandra's point too about the HTAC being an ongoing process is important. Because, in the States, for example, drugs like bevacizumab and other cancers outside of colorectal, didn't really pan out. And their recommendation was actually withdrawn later. So we should have the capacity, and oncologists don't want everything for everyone. If something doesn't pan out, maybe we should take it away. And there's no problem with that. But having that flexibility, I think, is very important. The overall survival endpoint is the ultimate endpoint, but I have some problems with it also. Because it's very hard to know, is it reasonable? If everyone on the trial crosses over to the new drug and gets it anyways, you're not going to see an overall survival difference necessarily because they got the new drug. And if we don't give the new drug to our patients, they won't have that chance to benefit from it. Mathematically, we like to insist that surrogacy of an endpoint, pathologic complete response, disease-free survival, surrogacy for OS has to be demonstrated disease by disease and therapy for therapy individually before it can be accepted. But I think we also, the groups have to individually discuss when is a surrogate clinically reasonable and clinically meaningful disease by disease. Not just the math, but given the spectrum of that patient's care, that cancer journey, there are situations where it makes a lot of sense. A diabetic does not care if 10 years from now they're alive or dead. They also care, are they on dialysis? Are they blind? Are they missing limbs? Right? And, in cancer, you can be full of metastases and be alive and not count to the stats. So I think we have to have a really, common sense way to look at these things.
Yeah. And I'm going to bridge to a question that we're receiving a number of questions from the audience. And the question is, has CADTH ever indicated what weight patient submissions or clinician submissions have in the deliberation process? This person has said, I've actually asked the question before, and there appears to be no measure whatsoever around that.
Alexandra, I know when CADTH and PCODER was starting, we got the impression it was sincerely considered. I don't feel that way now. What would you say, having been involved?
So absolutely, there is a process for patients and clinicians to participate in the HTA process, which I think is critical. I think, and again, having been at CADTH and now been outside CADTH, I think when I was at CADTH, I had a lot of faith that the expert review committee was looking at the clinician input, the patient input, because I was there and I sat at the table and I listened to the discussion. I think on the outside, the conversation that's happening at the table may not always be translated particularly well into the recommendations. And I think there's a gap, and I think there's an opportunity there to find more ways for patient voices to be heard and represented, and make sure that they're interpreted appropriately than they currently are. So I think there's definitely room for improvement. And again, it's difficult sitting on the outside, really understanding how that patient perspective and clinician perspective is being used.
Yeah, thank you for being so articulate on that front. The one might argue, though, that patient and patient groups, given the broader macro issues of access and time delays, it just seems that there needs to be more voice in elevating the expression of the issues to work towards solutions as well. I have to believe that both organizations in the regulatory bodies in this country are doing constant how do we be better assessments. There has been reach outs into global collaboration models more recently. Are these all good steps in the right direction, or is this going to get us anywhere fast? I mean, what's your perspective on that?
I've heard that there is discussions about collaborating even from the HTA perspective as well, not just the other side. But look at what they're saying, though. Like if they're overwhelmed and they suddenly have to fast track and start paying for drugs a year earlier, there's going to be firestorms and there'll be complaints. So they have to really expect, I think, to that kind of outcome, that we'll be getting faster access, but there's the added cost and complexity and staffing needs to do that correctly.
Alex, I'm going to give you the final word on this. I am shocked how quickly our time went together in such an important and critical conversation. So I'm going to give you the final word on this. What are those one or two things that need to be done in the next 6 months to be able to advance this conversation?
So that's a great question. I loved Sandy's suggestion of a performance target, and if there could be a way to align on a performance target that everyone agrees to, so it's Health Canada, it's the HTA agencies, it's PCPA, it's the provinces. Can we start working towards something, and can there be more awareness of where are the challenges, what are the gaps, and how do we move forward? Because I think we can say it's all well and good for Health Canada and CADA to move quickly, but if things aren't happening downstream, then it's all sort of a moot point. So if we could have a Canadian performance metric, I think that would be ideal.
Thank you so much for that.
The same thing exactly. Just do what they're doing half the time and have proper discourse about the cost per quality and the impact of PMPRB on rare diseases and cancers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think both of you have opened up a magnificent world of further discussion. Thank you again for the succinctness and the clarity with which you highlighted not just the issues, but some of the immediate steps and solutions that we can take. We're actually going to bridge now into a session which includes both Ines and Kadith at the table. I'm sure everybody after this conversation will be incredibly interested in hearing what they have to say in their perspective. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Sandy, so much for today.
Thank you very much.